The diplomatic vessel Solstice emerged from hyperspace, its sleek silver hull gleaming against the cold void. Captain Elias Vance stood at the bridge, gazing at the alien world of Varnus below. The planet was a marvel of shimmering ice oceans and towering crystalline spires, its cities etched into the land like delicate fractures in glass. It was beautiful in an austere, distant way, much like the people who called it home. The Xilari were not a species prone to warmth. Highly logical, efficient, and possessing a near-perfect memory, they saw emotions as distractions, unnecessary burdens that impeded progress. To them, humanity was an enigma, a species that thrived on chaos, passion, and unpredictable innovation. This very contrast had led to strained relations between the two civilizations, and Elias was here to change that. His orders were clear: secure a trade alliance. Humanity's expansion into the stars required reliable partners, and the Xilari possessed resources that Earth desperately needed. The problem was that Xilari leaders viewed humans as reckless, too prone to sentimentality and illogical thinking. The last diplomatic attempt had nearly collapsed when a human delegate, frustrated by the Xilari's cold detachment, had called them emotionless machines to their faces. Elias knew he had to tread carefully. The docking sequence completed with a precise hiss of decompression, and the airlock doors slid open. The Xilari delegation stood waiting, their tall, elegant figures draped in flowing robes woven from bioengineered fibers that shimmered subtly with every shift in movement. Their elongated skulls and deep-set, silver-hued eyes gave them a regal yet impassive appearance. Among them, one figure stood slightly ahead of the others: Ambassador Soraya. Elias had read her dossier. She was among the most influential Xilari diplomats, known for her meticulous logic and ability to dismantle opposition through sheer intellectual force. Unlike many of her kind, however, she had taken a particular interest in human psychology, studying it not with curiosity, but as a means of understanding a potential threat. As Elias stepped forward, Soraya inclined her head in a gesture of formal acknowledgement. "Captain Elias Vance," she said, her voice smooth and precise, as if each word was chosen with exacting care. "You are punctual. That is promising." Elias offered a polite smile. "Punctuality is a virtue in both our cultures, it seems." Soraya blinked once, a slow, deliberate movement. "Indeed, efficiency is necessary for progress. I trust you are prepared for the negotiations." "As prepared as one can be," he replied, "though I imagine neither of us can fully anticipate the outcome." A flicker of something, perhaps amusement, perhaps irritation, flashed in her silver eyes. Uncertainty is a flaw of organic existence, but it is one we must account for. "Follow me." The Xilari capital was unlike anything Elias had ever seen. Towering spires of translucent metal curved into the sky, connected by gravity-defying bridges that pulsed with energy. The air was crisp, the temperature perfectly regulated. Every aspect of the city was designed with purpose, with no wasted space or unnecessary decoration. Inside the negotiation chamber, a great circular table dominated the room, its surface etched with luminescent glyphs that shifted as Soraya and the other Xilari took their seats. Elias took his place opposite them, feeling their unblinking gazes settle on him like a scientist observing an unfamiliar specimen. The talks began as expected, formal, structured, and devoid of pleasantries. The Xilari valued efficiency above all else, and Soraya wasted no time outlining their concerns. "Humanity," she stated, "is unpredictable. Your species thrives on emotion-driven decision-making, which leads to instability. Trust must be earned through demonstrated consistency, yet your history suggests a pattern of erratic behavior." Elias listened, keeping his expression neutral. He had anticipated this. "With all due respect, Ambassador, adaptability is not the same as instability. Humanity's ability to adjust to new circumstances is what has allowed us to survive and thrive. We do not fear change. We embrace it." Soraya's gaze remained impassive. Change must be controlled. Chaos is an agent of destruction. And yet, Elias countered. Some of the greatest advancements in history were born from moments of chaos. Creativity, innovation. These things require a degree of unpredictability. Your people value efficiency, but efficiency alone does not create greatness. It maintains, but it does not inspire. For the first time, Soraya hesitated. It was brief, almost imperceptible, but Elias caught it. "These are subjective concepts," she said finally. "Inspiration is intangible." "Perhaps," Elias conceded. "But so is trust. And trust is what we need if we are to form an alliance." As silence settled over the room, the other auxiliary exchanged unreadable glances, but Soraya's gaze remained locked onto Elias. He could see the gears turning behind those silver eyes, the careful analysis of his words. She was searching for logic in his argument, for a framework that fit within the rigid structure of her world. Finally, she spoke. "Trust is earned through demonstration, not rhetoric. We will require evidence of your reliability before an agreement can be reached." Elias leaned forward slightly. "Then let us find a way to prove it." For the first time since their meeting, Soraya's expression shifted, not in a smile, not in any outward display of emotion, but in the smallest tilt of her head, a gesture of consideration. Perhaps, Elias thought, this was the first crack in the ice. The negotiations continued for hours, a careful exchange of logic and counterarguments, with Soraya and Elias locked in a battle of reason versus adaptability. The auxiliary delegation dissected every proposal with clinical precision, analyzing potential inefficiencies and risks with an unrelenting focus. Elias, for his part, remained composed, countering their skepticism with carefully framed arguments that highlighted humanity's strengths without dismissing the auxiliary's concerns. But despite his efforts, progress was slow. The auxiliary simply did not operate on instinct or emotion. Every decision was methodical, stripped of personal bias. Elias found himself walking a tightrope, trying to appeal to minds that had little room for anything but cold rationale. At one point, Soraya leaned back slightly in her chair, her long fingers steepled together. "Captain Vance, your proposals are well structured, but they remain theoretical. The auxiliary do not deal in possibilities. We require demonstrable proof of stability, not words." Elias exhaled through his nose, considering his next move. He knew they wouldn't simply accept a diplomatic alliance based on goodwill alone, but he had hoped for some flexibility. Instead, Soraya was demanding tangible assurances, something humanity couldn't immediately provide. "Then let's conduct a trial," he said finally. "A demonstration of our reliability. Give us a task, something of value to your people. If we succeed, you'll have proof that we can work together." Soraya regarded him in silence, her silver eyes narrowing slightly, and Elias felt an odd sense of anticipation. It was the first time he had seen even a fraction of hesitation from her. The other auxiliary murmured among themselves in their native tongue, a harmonic sequence of clicks and layered tones that sounded almost musical. Finally, Soraya nodded. "Very well. There is a matter requiring immediate resolution." She gestured toward a glowing display that flickered to life on the table. A holographic projection emerged, displaying a section of Varnus' icy surface. "One of our research outposts in the Felsen Expanse has gone silent. It is a critical facility, gathering data on the structural integrity of the ice fields. Our attempts to re-establish communication have failed." Elias studied the projection. "You suspect sabotage." "Unlikely," Soraya replied. "There are no hostile factions within our borders. However, the region is volatile. Shifts in the ice can destabilize entire structures. If the outpost has suffered a breach, the researchers may be at risk. Our protocols dictate caution, but if you wish to prove your capability, this is an opportunity." Elias recognized the weight of what she was offering. Auxiliary research outpost was no trivial matter. If the auxiliary were willing to let humans intervene, even on a minor crisis, It meant they were willing to test their trust. "I'll need a small team," he said, "and unrestricted access to any data regarding the outpost's last known status." Soraya inclined her head. "Agreed. You depart within the hour." As Elias rose from his seat, he caught the faintest flicker of something in her expression. Curiosity, perhaps. Interest. It was gone before he could be certain, but it gave him hope. Maybe, just maybe, this was the breakthrough he needed. The Solstice's shuttle bay was a flurry of controlled activity as Elias assembled his team. His chief engineer, Lieutenant Karis Monroe, was already running diagnostics on the shuttle's environmental seals, ensuring they could withstand the unpredictable conditions of the Thelsen expanse. Beside her, Ensign Dario Feng, a communications specialist, reviewed the scrambled signals from the research outpost, trying to decipher any hidden distress calls buried in the static. "This is a hell of a first assignment," Karis muttered, sealing up a toolkit as Elias approached. "Rescue op in an ice wasteland. These Tilari don't mess around." Elias offered a wry smile. "They're giving us a chance to prove ourselves. That's more than I expected." Dario glanced up from his console. "I've been going through the last transmission we received from the outpost. It's weird. No signs of panic, no distress calls, just sudden silence." Elias frowned. "That doesn't make sense. Even if there was a breach, standard procedure would be to trigger an emergency beacon." Karis shot him a look. "Unless something prevented them from doing that." The thought was unsettling, but Elias pushed it aside. Speculation wouldn't help them now. Minutes later, they were aboard the shuttle, descending toward the frozen surface of Varnus. The Thelsen expanse stretched endlessly below them, an alien landscape of jagged ice formations and swirling snow, illuminated by the eerie glow of the planet's twin moons. The research outpost came into view, a cluster of sleek, silver structures half buried in the ice, their lights flickering erratically. "Landing protocols engaged," Karis reported, gripping the controls as the shuttle rocked slightly from the turbulent winds. "Atmospheric conditions are stable, but I'm reading structural inconsistencies in the outpost's main dome." Elias activated the comms. "Outpost Theta, this is Captain Elias Vance of the Solstice. Do you read me?" Silence. Dario adjusted the frequency. Still nothing. If they're in there, they're not answering. Elias exhaled slowly. "Then we're going in blind. Gear up." The shuttle touched down with a soft jolt, its landing struts digging into the ice. The team stepped onto the frozen terrain, their boots crunching against the crystalline surface. The cold was immediate and biting, even through their insulated suits. The auxiliary structures loomed ahead, partially shrouded by swirling snow, their normally pristine exteriors marred by deep fractures. Karis ran a scanner over the entrance. "The outer seals are intact, but there's some damage to the power grid. Could be why the comms are down." Elias pressed his hand against the door panel. It was unresponsive. With a nod to Karis, he stepped back as she accessed the manual override, forcing the doors open with a groan of protest. The interior was eerily quiet. Dim emergency lights flickered along the walls, casting elongated shadows across the metallic corridors. Equipment lay scattered on the floor, as if abandoned in haste. Dario swallowed. Something's not right. Elias' gaze swept the room, his pulse steady but alert. They had come to prove humanity's reliability, to demonstrate their worth as allies. But as he took another step forward, he couldn't shake the growing sense that whatever had happened here, it wasn't just an accident. The air inside the ship felt heavier than before, thick with unspoken tension. Lucan stood near the viewport, staring at the sprawling alien station in the distance, its luminous surface pulsing like a living thing. Ever since their arrival, something had gnawed at him, a feeling that they were being watched, not just by the diplomatic envoys, but by something else entirely. He turned slightly, watching Ava as she scanned over the latest transmissions from the station's central command. She looked composed, but he could see the way her fingers tapped absently against the console, betraying the same unease that had settled over him. "It doesn't add up," she murmured, more to herself than to him. "The peace talks, the urgency, the insistence that we be here in person. It's too perfect, too controlled." She met his gaze, and he nodded, feeling the same doubts clawing at the edges of his mind. The Alarethian delegation had been polite, almost overly so. Their representative, High Speaker Varish, had delivered his speeches with an eerie precision, his every word measured as if reading from a script. Their customs were intricate, but nothing about their interactions suggested sincerity. And then there was the way their security forces moved, swift, efficient, and ever-present, lingering just close enough to remind the humans that they were under constant surveillance. Lucan exhaled sharply. "We need more information. The reports from the frontier colonies don't match what they're telling us. Something happened out there, something they don't want us to know." Ava nodded, pulling up a restricted file she had been decrypting in the background. "The distress signals we intercepted before arrival. They were cut off mid-transmission. No emergency beacons, no survivors, just silence." She hesitated before tapping into the final decrypted segment. The playback flickered to life, the garbled message, barely coherent, but the fear in the voice was unmistakable. "Not alone. We thought it was safe. No warning." There, the transmission dissolved into static. Lucan felt a cold chill crawl up his spine. The voice had belonged to a veteran commander, stationed on the outermost human settlement near Alarethian space. That colony was gone now, wiped from existence without explanation. And yet, here they were, shaking hands and exchanging pleasantries with the very species that had promised they had no involvement in the disappearances. A sudden chime interrupted the silence, an incoming communication from the station. Ava switched the console over, and the image of High Speaker Varish materialized before them, his deep-set eyes unreadable. "Ambassadors," he said smoothly, his elongated features betraying no emotion. "We are pleased to extend an invitation to the Grand Chamber for the next phase of our discussions. We hope you will find our hospitality satisfactory." Lucan narrowed his eyes. Something in the way he said those words sent a wave of unease through him. Ava hesitated for only a fraction of a second before nodding. "We would be honored," she said evenly. The transmission cut out. Lucan exhaled. "We need to be careful." Ava glanced at him. "We need more than that. We need proof." Moments later, they moved through the docking bay, their diplomatic escorts flanking them with silent efficiency. The Grand Chamber was an architectural marvel. Towering crystalline structures wove together in seamless patterns, the air humming with an artificial atmosphere tailored to suit multiple species. But Lucan wasn't interested in the grandeur. His eyes were on the side corridors, the sealed-off sectors, the doors that required biometric clearance. Somewhere in this station, the truth was buried, and he had no doubt that whatever it was, the Alarethians would kill to keep it hidden. As they reached the central hall, a sudden shift in the air made him pause. The energy field that had been a faint hum in the background surged, almost imperceptibly, but he caught it. He turned his head slightly, his gaze landing on a side alcove where a shadow moved just out of sight. Ava followed his line of sight. "You see it too," she whispered. He didn't respond. He didn't need to. The talks began as expected. Formalities, reassurances, strategic discussions, but Lucan could barely focus. His instincts screamed at him that something was deeply wrong. And then, in the middle of a speech about peace and cooperation, the lights flickered. Just once. Barely noticeable, but the shift in the Alarethian officials' expressions was undeniable. A warning. Or a mistake. Lucan's heart pounded as he met Ava's eyes. Whatever was coming, they were running out of time to stop it. The chamber remained silent for a fraction of a second too long, a moment where time seemed to stretch unnaturally. The flicker in the lights had been subtle, almost imperceptible, but Lucan had seen the tension ripple through the Alarethian officials like a shockwave. High speaker Varish, always composed, had gone rigid for just a heartbeat before masking his reaction behind a practiced facade of diplomacy. That alone told Lucan everything he needed to know. Something was wrong. Ava shifted slightly beside him, her posture unchanging, but he could sense the heightened alertness in the way she angled her body. She had seen it too. The weight of unspoken realization passed between them, a silent understanding built from years of experience. They had walked into something far bigger than a simple peace negotiation, and now every instinct told Lucan that their survival depended on figuring out what it was before it was too late. Varish cleared his throat, an almost human gesture, though the resonance of his voice carried an unnatural smoothness. "Apologies for the disturbance," he said with a calculated ease. "A minor power fluctuation. It is of no concern." Lucan let the lie settle between them like a blade waiting to drop. He met Varish's gaze and held it, searching for the crack beneath the surface, but the alien's expression remained unreadable. "It happens often?" Ava asked, her tone light, but Lucan knew her well enough to hear the deliberate probing beneath her words. Varish smiled, or at least mimicked the human gesture of one. "Rarely," he said. "Our systems are quite advanced. You need not worry." Lucan wasn't convinced. He let his gaze drift across the chamber, past the diplomats, past the guards stationed along the perimeter. The architecture of the station was exquisite, a masterpiece of design that seamlessly blended aesthetics with functionality. But it was more than just a symbol of power. It was a fortress. Every corridor, every doorway, every unseen level below them, it all had a purpose. The Alarethians weren't just hosting a diplomatic summit. They were hiding something. A chime echoed through the chamber, signaling the continuation of the discussion. But even as the talks resumed, Lucan could barely focus. His mind raced through the possibilities, the inconsistencies, the quiet details that had gnawed at him from the moment they had set foot on this station. Then movement. Out of the corner of his eye, near one of the archways leading into the chamber, a figure appeared just for an instant before vanishing again into the shadows. It was quick, too quick to be one of the standard Alarethian guards. His pulse quickened, but he forced himself to remain still. He turned slightly, enough to see Ava without drawing attention. She had caught it too. Without a word, she reached for the diplomatic tablet in front of her and typed out a short message, the text appearing on his own interface a second later. "Not Alarethian. Someone else is here." He kept his expression neutral as he responded. "Prisoner, spy, or something worse." Ava hesitated before typing again. "We need to find out." Lucan exhaled slowly. They were running out of time. If someone else was lurking in the station's restricted areas, it meant one of two things. Either they were being watched by a third party, or there was something so dangerous on this station that even the Alarethians were struggling to contain it. Neither possibility boded well for humanity. The talks dragged on, but Lucan had already made up his mind. They needed to get off the main diplomatic floor and into the deeper sections of the station. He had no doubt that security would be tight, but he had learned long ago that no system was infallible. Every fortress had its weak point. An opportunity presented itself sooner than expected. During a recess, as the Alarethian officials dispersed momentarily to their private quarters, Lucan and Ava were granted a moment of relative freedom. They moved quickly, keeping their pace measured, but with a purpose. The station was vast, a labyrinth of corridors that extended far beyond the designated diplomatic zones. The moment they veered from the authorized pathways, Lucan felt the change immediately. The lighting dimmed, the polished elegance of the upper levels giving way to something more industrial. Ava tapped into her interface, running silent scans. "There's a secondary power grid running below this level," she murmured. "Separate from the main systems. Looks like it's drawing a lot of energy." Lucan frowned. "For what?" She worked quickly, pulling up a rough layout of the station's infrastructure. "There's a containment sector here," she said, pointing to a section that wasn't supposed to exist. "Highly secured, multiple access restrictions. Whatever's down there, it's not just technology. Lucan clenched his jaw. It's alive. They pressed on, navigating the deserted halls with careful precision. The further they went, the stronger the tension became. It was no longer just a feeling of being watched. There was something else, an unnatural stillness that made the air feel heavy, charged with something neither of them could name. Then they heard it, a sound, faint but unmistakable, a low, resonating pulse, almost like a heartbeat, but deeper, more unnatural. Ava stopped in her tracks, her eyes wide. "That's not machinery," she whispered. Lucan felt a cold weight settle in his stomach. Whatever the Alarethians had hidden beneath this station, it wasn't just a secret. It was something they feared. And now, he and Ava were walking straight into it. The sound grew louder with every step, reverberating through the metallic walls like the pulse of something vast and unseen. It wasn't just a noise. It was a presence, a force that pushed against Lucan's senses like an unseen tide. He felt it in his chest, in his bones, an unnatural vibration that made his instincts scream at him to turn back. But he pressed on, because whatever lay ahead was the reason the Alarethians were so desperate to keep this station a secret. Ava's breath was steady, but he could see the tension in her frame, the way her fingers hovered just above the concealed weapon at her side. They had entered a different section of the station now. Colder, darker. The walls were no longer the pristine silver white of the diplomatic levels, but a dull industrial gray, reinforced with layers of plating that suggested containment rather than mere construction. The corridors were narrower, the air thick with an unspoken weight. Then they reached it, a set of massive doors, their surface etched with Alarethian script, warning glyphs, if Lucan had to guess. The pulse emanated from beyond them, steady, rhythmic, but now layered with something else. A whisper, not quite audible, not quite real. It was less a sound and more an intrusion in his thoughts, a pressure at the edge of perception. Ava exhaled sharply. "Do you hear that?" Lucan nodded. "It's in my head." For the first time, hesitation flickered across her expression. "That's not normal. None of this is." He reached for his interface, attempting to override the lock, but the system rejected him instantly. Not just a denial, an outright refusal, as though the station itself was resisting. Ava was already moving, pulling out a portable bypass module, working quickly to infiltrate the security. "They really don't want anyone in here," she muttered. "This encryption is." The door opened, not because of her efforts, but because something on the other side had let them in. Lucan's pulse spiked as the massive panels groaned apart, revealing the chamber beyond. The air that rushed out was thick, heavy, carrying an almost electric charge that made the hair on his arms rise. And in the center of the chamber, suspended within a containment field of crackling energy, was something that should not exist. It was enormous, humanoid in shape, but wrong in ways that defied simple description. Its form shimmered, constantly shifting between something solid and something incorporeal, as though it existed on the edge of multiple realities at once. Its skin, or what passed for it, was a deep iridescent black, reflecting no light yet seeming to absorb everything around it. But its eyes, if they could even be called that, were the worst part. Twin voids, deep and endless, gazing at them with an awareness that made Lucan's breath hitch. The entity twitched, and the entire chamber shuddered as if reality itself had bent inward for a fraction of a second. Ava sucked in a sharp breath. "Lucan, this isn't just some prisoner." "No," he said slowly. "This is something older. Something they didn't create. A sound, not quite a voice, but something that bypassed the ears entirely, rippled through the chamber. A sensation of amusement, of recognition. You are not them." Lucan's mind reeled. It had spoken, directly into his thoughts. Ava took a half-step closer, her voice tight. "What are you?" The entity shifted slightly, the energy around it pulsing in tandem with the unnatural heartbeat. "I am the remnant. I am the warning." Lucan swallowed hard, warning of what? The void-like eyes bore into him. Of what comes next. A sharp alarm blared through the station, a piercing wail that sent red emergency lights flaring across the chamber. The containment field crackled violently, flickering, destabilizing. Then, from the doorway behind them, a voice. Harsh, commanding, desperate. Step away from it. Lucan turned to see High Speaker Varish standing at the threshold, flanked by heavily armed Alarethian guards. His composed diplomat's mask was gone, replaced by something raw. Fear. You don't understand what you're dealing with, Varish said, his voice urgent. It must not be freed. Lucan's mind raced. Whatever this being was, the Alarethians weren't protecting it. They were trapping it, and from the look on Varish's face, they weren't sure how much longer they could keep it contained. Ava glanced at Lucan, her expression unreadable. If they're this scared of it. The entity twitched again, and the air around them rippled, as though space itself had momentarily fractured. The containment field flickered dangerously. You fear what you do not comprehend, it whispered into their minds. And you will suffer for it. Varish barked an order, and the guards raised their weapons. Lucan knew, in that moment, they were out of time. This station wasn't a diplomatic hub. It was a prison. And whatever was locked away here, whatever ancient force the Alarethians had desperately tried to keep hidden, was waking up. And humanity had just walked straight into the storm.